Bonjour à tous.
Hello, everybody. So we're going to make a start. So can I ask you all to sit down? So to start this marathon day, this very hot day, we're going to start with an important question for the future of our industry. We're going to be talking about competitiveness in the context of decarbonisation, which is no longer an option. And we're talking about reindustrialising the country and the European continent. How can we move back to a form of sovereignty in a certain number of industrial sectors in a context where, well, the trade balance excluding energy is very much downgraded. So thank you to our 5 participants for being here for this early morning session. Before we start the debate, I'm going to hand over to Lionel Fontagne from the Cercle des Économistes, who's going to be framing the debate. Thank you. Hello, everybody. So I'm going to be framing the debate like an economist. We're going to be talking about fairly general things, but I'm going to take a point of view that is international. As has been reminded, the general idea is to talk about decarbonisation. But we're talking about the strategy of decarbonisation in a competitive industry. So the climate is what economists refer to as a common good. But conserving our climate, which is what we all want, protecting it, it means collective action shared between different countries. Each country has an interest in preserving the climate, but no country has an interest in acting alone because the efforts will be diluted at worldwide scale. Those making the most efforts will have to move around and help countries making fewer efforts. If a country is making a lot of effort, and if the country is big enough like Europe, the fact that Europe is using a lot less fossil fuel will bring down the balance, and that should encourage others to consume more. So all of that is fairly disastrous. So we've tried to find some solutions at international level in order to move forward. There are 3 types of solutions that I'd like to quickly go through. The first is the multilateral solution. We all agree that multilateralism is much better than everything else. And for those who have been coming to X for a long time, you know, multilateralism is not going to provide a solution to everything. In terms of climate, the ambitions are high. And given what we have, we've got the Paris Agreement, which is very good. It's a step forward, but you know how it works. Each country announces in a voluntary manner a level of decarbonisation that it will reach at a certain date. And this is what we heard from William Andel, the Nobel Prize winner. So if you add together what everybody promises to do, then we haven't paid the bill. And not only is it not enough, these commitments are not constraining, they're not obligatory. So Paris, well, multilateralism is just part of the answer. So maybe we need to go towards multilateralism. That's a club of countries that will share the same climate ambition, and that will manage to achieve its ambitious objectives with different means. The only problem, and this is a problem that economists know how to deal with, is to find the common metrics. Billions of dollars spent, efforts made through the markets, efforts based on subsidies, efforts in terms of tax reductions, and efforts in terms of regulations. Economists know how to give an implicit price, a shadow price to all of that, and so we can compare the efforts of each one. The problem is that if we have a club like that, which is made up of the United States for steel, you know, there was the steel club, and that was the European Commission didn't want to hear about this. If ever we did this, we need to protect ourselves at the borders of the club to prevent the problem of the carbon leakage. Theoretically, it's possible, but in practice, geopolitics is very complicated. It's very much full of conflicts, and we will have immediate problems with our Australian friends, our Indian friends, our Chinese friends, etc. So it's not really a solution to have something that's multilateral. So maybe we need unilateral action. So unilateral action, this is what the European Union decided with its Green Deal, the Fit for 55, in the jargon used. And this has been very much mediatized with the environmental side of the Inflation Reduction Act, which aims for the same objective, decarbonizing with the means that we're talking about. They're very different means. Now, the advantage of unilateral action is it means effective commitments on behalf of countries. We're really going to do it. We're really going to move forward. We're really going to decarbonize. But the problem there is that if some do this with market instruments more than anything else, in other words, prices, price signals like we've done in Europe, whereas others are doing it with subsidies and tax reductions like in the United States, this is going to be problematic. It's going to distort competition, and we'll nevertheless have to protect ourselves. So Europeans are doing it with a border carbon mechanism, and the Americans are doing it with clauses that are specific, clauses that are part of IRA provisions. They suggest making some parts of cars in the United States, the battery, for example. So there are local integration clauses that mean that some of the added value of products comes from the United States. How do we stop having to rely on subsidies? We've got unilateral actions that are necessary with the preservation of what economists call the level playing field, a space for competition that works at international level. This is the theme that our speakers will be debating this morning. Thank you very much, Lionel. So, yes, our 5 speakers. Let us go through the 5 speakers. Hello, Guillaume FAURY. So you are the CEO of Airbus. Maciej, WITUCKIC. You're the president of the Polish Confederation, Lewiatan. You're kind of the MEDEF in Poland. Xavier, you're the president of the board of RT. Sylvie, JÉHANNO, you're the CEO of the company Dalkia. And Goldy, you're president and head of management of the Business Council of Canada. Thank you to all 5 of you for being here. So we're going to start with by framing things. Xavier said this, decarbonization. It's about reframing things, providing figures, looking at the carbon emissions of industry. You're saying that decarbonizing industry is a big driver. Perhaps it's easier to activate this than looking at household behavior. Yes, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. So just some ideas. I'm going to talk about France because that will be easier for me. So 450 million tons of CO2 emitted a year. The manufacturing industry and construction, out of 450, it's 80 million tons. So that's 20%. And just to give you an idea of this kind of emission, if we just take Dunkirk in the north of France and Fos-sur-Mer in the south of France, we're talking about 2 industrial sites that emit 20 million tons. So you can see that industrial emissions, not just, well, for France, it's important. And they're very much concentrated as well. This concerns a small number of stakeholders. And from this point of view, it's a driver that can be activated with more difficulty than a fine decarbonization of households, for example. So that's the first thing. And I'd like to come back to what you said about the Fit for 55. It's fairly barbaric, this jargon. It's the union that is committed to reducing its emissions by 55% with respect to 1990. We're only halfway there in France. We were supposed to have started in 1990, but the milestone is 2030. So we've only got 7 years to go. So, you know, we've got our work cut out for us. And when we're looking for big levers for doing this, and let me come back to point number 1, industry and its huge emissions, for example, in Dunkirk and Fos, they can act as drivers, but it's going to be problematic from an investment, a competitiveness point of view, and we'll talk about these things later on. Now, so the question of competitiveness, Guillaume Faury, in the air sector, you're saying that decarbonisation is more a subject. It's not just the scope 3; it's the use. It's when the airplanes are in the sky. So what about decarbonisation relating to kerosene rather than the building itself of the airplanes? Can you develop that point, please? Yes. Hello, everybody. So aviation. It's 2.5% of carbon emissions in the world, so 50 gigatons. So it's a bit more than 1 gigaton. So where do these emissions come from? If I take the example of Airbus, so that's Airbus makes half of the commercial airplanes in the world. Our scope 1 and scope 2, in other words, the company's emissions at worldwide level amount to 1 million tons. However, if we take scope 3 emissions from the fleet of Airbus planes over 1 year, that we're looking at 500 million tons. So it goes down with time, but it's 500 million tons. So our objective is to decarbonize the use of airplanes rather than the factories making airplanes. So 1 million tons, that's a lot, and we have to do something about it. Now, we're talking about a subject that's very much linked to the introduction that was made by Lionel. To do things efficiently and quickly, decarbonisation needs to be a factor of competitiveness. And in some cases, we've got the things are aligned between decarbonisation and competitiveness, but not in all sectors. So today, 25% of the world airplane fleet are the latest generation of airplanes. 3/4 of our airplanes are old. They're from a previous generation. When you replace an old airplane with a new airplane, you reduce by 20 to 40% the carbon emissions for the same flights. So we've got an alignment between competitiveness and decarbonisation in this case. And that's why we're seeing a huge demand for new generation airplanes. And you probably followed what happened in Bourget. We're coming out of COVID, and yet there are many orders for airplanes. Now, the second case where we've got an alignment, it's when we want to invest in order to design tomorrow's planes, in order to continue to reduce consumption and carbon emissions. And today we're investing for a generation of airplanes that will be coming into service between 2035 and 2040, which will allow us to reduce our carbon emissions by 25 to 30%. And again, we've got an alignment between competitiveness and decarbonisation. Now, where we don't have this alignment between competitiveness and industrialization is the second idea, use of fuel. So they're much more expensive than fossil fuels. So this is what Lionel was explaining. So whoever is leading the dance is using more decarbonized fuel, but that's a loss of competitiveness. It's not something that encourages industry to move forward. So how do we come out of this problem? Either we've got to oblige or realign the two. Realigning the two, this is what the United States are doing with IRA. So there are considerable subsidies for decarbonized fuels. So they've becoming competitive, and we're seeing massive investments, and companies are committing to offtake using decarbonized fuels. This works very well, but it's a public policy that is very expensive. It's expensive. It creates a competitiveness factor in the United States compared with the rest of the world. It's not multilateral, so that's why there are lots of responses to this. It's also possible to create a level playing field, so something that's homogeneous for everybody, by obliging people to do things. Then you oblige people to accept the idea that it's less competitive, but it's less competitive in the same way for everybody, and so everybody goes down that path. So in an economy that is multi-local, we can do this intelligently. In an economy that's global, like aviation, it doesn't work because they're all in competition with each other, and if you agree to be less competitive in order to have a level playing wheel, but you've not got the same thing at the end of the day, then you're penalized. So that's why it's very difficult to move forward with the question of fuels. Now, last year, there was an agreement at world level that was taken to move towards 2050 with complete decarbonization of the aviation sector with several mechanisms, one called CORSIA, which is an offset fuel mechanism, but it's long and it doesn't work very well to begin with. And that's why some regions like Europe have decided to go a lot faster and to be more demanding, because it's all a question of speed. However, agreeing to be less competitive in this field. So there's a real hot topic. That is the question of energy. We need transition. We need a transition at the cost of energy. And access to decarbonized fuel is not expensive. And then this brings us back to the question of humanity. And the last thing that I'll go through very quickly is the use of fuel during flights. You can have long-haul flights, so you can have waiting times, so you can improve air transport systems. But this means a lot of agreements between different countries, and that's why it's very difficult to move ahead swiftly. It's all a question of speed. When you have an alignment, then we can do things ourselves. But if there's no alignment, we need public policies, and we need agreements between countries, and that's where the difficulties lie. We all have common interests, but there are also individual competitive interests, and it's this game that we have ahead of us. So, Maciej, you are the representative of the field of people who are not very nice. You're in the coal world. So the cost of what's not expensive means opening mines. You say it's your economic model that is at stake, and the companies that you represent are not necessarily aligned with your executive members. Yes, we've got centuries of tradition, dichotomies between those who govern in the country, and then there's the fact that the government is organizing the elections at the moment. But seriously, we're in the front line because we're very interested. I'm talking about the Polish industry. So it was reindustrialized over the past 30 years, Poland. And Poland today, it's a bit like the suburbs of the German industry, and we're proud of that. But all of that, we're feeling that we're seeing the first signs in the Intel factory. So that's going to be working with the microprocessors. Magdeburg is using green energy we don't have in Poland. The Tesla factory, for example, is next to Berlin because it wants to attract Polish workers, but it wants a German green approach. So the Polish industry is very much conscious of everything. It's very much green. It's almost greener than the center of Europe, of the European Union, because our products really depend on competition. On this little goblet manufactured in Norway, it's white, but if it was made in Poland, it would be black. And people don't want to buy such beakers. It's going to be a tool of competition, not just global competition, as in the case of Airbus, but there's going to be, it relates to European competition. People are going to be using these arguments, and it's normal. So I think that the solution to all of that in Poland, and this is what I hear, is increasingly, we've been talking about it, is increasingly going to be a unilateral solution with a strong federal entity. We'll let competition be managed by countries, not by countries, because otherwise we won't manage things. We're seeing this with the eternal discussion about the color of hydrogen. The French and the Germans and whoever can't agree to what green hydrogen is. They all want to have their own hydrogen being promoted, you know, the real French hydrogen or the real German hydrogen, so to speak. We're seeing this very well. And in Poland, let me remind you that in spite of the image of the bête noire, we have lots of benefits from being members of the European Union. And we've got a lot of potential as well. There are too many negative effects if you want to leaving the structure. So we need to federalize what we can. So things are moving ahead slowly, especially with the crises. Things are progressing. Competition needs to stay. We mustn't be managed by a super European state. In Poland, the government has state companies. So competition needs to belong to private companies. But with respect to standardization and policies, they need to be European. Otherwise, we won't manage things. So the strategy what Thierry Breton was referring to, the strategic autonomy in France does not exist at European level. Well, only if we take into account Ukraine and human resources. We're not going to manage with our own club. So politicians are beginning to be a bit more courageous when it comes to a common strategy, but they need to leave space for companies so that we've got capitalistic-based competition with central structures, and that will help us to rise to the challenge. And just to finish, decarbonization of Poland, so that we're in line with the Fit for 55 objective, is going to be more expensive than the IRA in the United States. 400 billion euros, so the challenge is really quite considerable. And if we don't do it, the CBM, the carbon tax, is perhaps going to be at the border between Germany and Poland. And we don't want carbon tax to be on the Oder River, because that will kill the success of my country that was built up in the last 30 years. Sylvie, JÉHANNO. So it's also about technical solutions, isn't it? And technical solutions, they exist, don't they? We have to go faster and be better. Yes, thank you, Beatrice. Hello, everybody. Let me just open a parenthesis about Dalkia. It's the subsidiary of EDF, and we have solutions. We're a specialist of decarbonization and energy transition in areas, cities, in industry and in buildings by optimizing the energy used on sites and the production of heat. In other words, heating, hot water, all according to low-carbon strategies. So let me come back to what Xavier was saying. It's urgent to decarbonize industry. In France, we're talking about 20% of CO2 emissions that come from industry. And as it's a bit hot in Aix, I don't know whether we're beating a record, but on the 4th of July, we beat a record. It was the hottest day on Earth. So, you know, we need to speed things up. We need to speed things up. And when we look at what's happening in industry, effectively, there are already many, many things to be done. The first subject, which is the subject of this roundtable, it's competitiveness. We need to make energy savings. How can we reduce consumption in industry? All studies show that we can still reduce things by 15 to 20%. So in spite of industrial efforts, when we look at what's happening in France and we look at the lowering of CO2 emissions, we have the impression that France has followed the objectives and been a good pupil. We've already reduced emissions, but we've offset emissions imported. So it's in our interest to reindustrialize. So energy efficiency, sobriety, I think everybody's understood what that means this winter. So when we look at the production of heat on industrial sites, we were talking about Fos and Dunkirk. Heat, it's industrial vapor to dry things out for the agro-food industry. You can imagine what it is. It's a hot topic. 60% of that production of heat is produced based on fossil fuels. So how can we chase this fossil energy? How can we reduce CO2 emissions? Well, today, we know how to produce industrial heat that is low-carbon industrial heat. We're replacing fuel and gas with biomass. Now, of course, there's a question of prioritization. We talked about low-carbon kerosene. There's biomass. But in France, we know how to make big boilers based on fuel wood, on recycled materials, retrieved materials from the yellow bin where there is waste that is sorted. We know how to burn that. It's also a way of producing low-carbon heat. Now, the third element concerns electrification. We're talking a lot about that. We think that the electric mix in industry is going to be doubling. So there's going to be a big need for electrification. For example, when you have a gas oven, if you can replace it by an electric oven, because electricity is low carbon, then it's a good possibility. Another solution is based on hydrogen. Hydrogen with its different colors. Let's talk about low carbon hydrogen. When you're in EDF, low carbon is all about nuclear and renewable energy. So that's going to help us to decarbonize industry. There are many questions around hydrogen, the infrastructures that are associated with hydrogen production. These are subjects that are all being debated. I'd also like to talk about the circular economy and its relation to industrial decarbonization. We know how to recover waste heat. In Dunkirk, for example, you can have 100% renewable energy systems. You can replace gas and fuel boilers in houses, for example. You can produce renewable energy using wood, but also you can pick up heat from a foundry, for example. If you take Stellantis, they make aluminium, and that heat is lost. We can recover it and use it to heat people in a city. That's what they do in Dunkirk with Arcelor. These are subjects being developed. There's a source of waste heat that can be exploited. There's geothermal strategies as well, surface geothermal strategies. There are heat pumps as well that can be associated with geothermal structures and electricity in order to decarbonize industry. And I'm going to finish with something relating to the circular economy. All process recycling systems have to be taken into account. We have to decarbonize energy systems, but also the processes used by industrialists. And when you make copper and aluminium, you're reusing recycled aluminium, and that's all part of the solution. One last point, the very last point. It concerns residual CO2. We can pick that up. We can sequestrate it. It's what we refer to as carbon capture that is used and stored. So we can pick this up from pipes and we can store that CO2 infini, because those emissions, we don't know how to deal with them. And then just to introduce the subject, and I'll finish there, there are two key success factors that have already been suggested today in the previous speeches. Financing, how do you support these efforts? And then there's also the question of, well, we talked about industry in Germany. Perhaps public powers are helping, but, they're looking for manpower in Poland. So the subject of skills is also another subject.
Thank you, Sylvie. We never talked so much in Europe about the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. All European industrialists got scared last fall. So now, how do you look at this in Canada? This like a declaration of war from the US, and finally, how do you see the Canadian or European response? And is it a true danger in most a risk of deindustrialization for the countries?
Well, first of all, good morning, and thank you for having me. I'm showing my mercy on all of you by not sharing my grade 12 Western Canadian French. But I am privileged to be here with this panel, and thank you again for my first time here. We've been talking frameworks. I want to talk facts. Starting with the most obvious fact. Carbon, like COVID, knows no boundaries. So whatever any country does by itself, or whatever any region does by itself, is frankly moot. Just one observation. Two, if we don't help China, and we don't help India decarbonize, we're wasting our time. We're responsible for the emissions in China and India as West, because we chose them to be our manufacturing hub, to make things we want that are good quality for cheap. That human behavior is not going to change. Something else we need to consider. They are emitting because they're heavily reliant on coal. Why? Because we have failed to be able to get them gas and other sources of decarbonizing energy that they need. Okay? We've had false debates about nuclear. I know France is one of the welcome places I can talk about this, but Canadians are very proud of nuclear. But for the longest time, environmentalists drove an agenda that was anti-nuclear. That is incoherent with the facts. Any study you have seen will say you will not achieve net zero without nuclear mix. And yet, we have allowed that narrative to take hold. However, the Russia reset, as I call it, is a moment to bring back the facts. The facts are fossil fuels will continue to be used for decades, at least 2 to 3 decades. Not my assessment. OECD's own analysis shows this. So you have to make sure you're getting access to as clean energy of fossil fuels as you can. That's a requirement that we should be doing, which means building the infrastructure to be able to get it to market. It's difficult for Europe to have LNG because you're relying right now on Russia. You frankly get more, you're still getting a lot of gas from Russia. It's somewhat of a well-kept secret, but the truth is you're getting a lot of it. And we've got to make sure that we can help you decarbonize. And this Russia reset is a moment for us to look at how are we going to help each other. We cannot do it on our own. The other thing, and this has been mentioned a lot at this conference, and it's a universal theme in the C-suites, certainly that I speak with, and that is the consequence of the decline of democracy. There are less democracies in the world today than there were 25 years ago. So if we have the best system, why are we losing? What is it that we've done to ourselves that have created an environment in which capital that is agnostic on ideology, that is agnostic on nationality, is going to the places where it's more welcome, where it has better public policy, where it has more confidence, more stability, more predictability to be deployed to realize the purpose of that deployment. If we don't fix democracies, if we continue to attack public institutions in our narratives at all opportunities, if we have a political environment that is no longer based on common sense, it certainly isn't based on leadership, mostly followership. If black becomes white after every election, how is business supposed to invest with any sense of long-term predictability, confidence that capital will be welcomed, that it can be deployed, and that its purpose can eventually be realized? If we don't fix that, we won't be able to play in this game at all. So what did the Americans do about this? They created the IRA. The very ill-named, but the IRA is effectively industrial policy. And one thing about America, you never short her. When she goes big or she goes home. Now the problem is, when you talk about words like friendshoring and nearshoring, things that attributed to America, Janet Yellen and others, it cannot mean America shoring. And for many, that's what it has meant. Europe's own response was to come together to say we have to compete with America's aggressive movement, and good for them for being able to do it, but the rest of us don't have the global currency of the world. So the race to the bottom with subsidies is only going to get you so far. Never mind the deficits and the debts that that's going to create. I think we have to do a better job of coordinating industrial policy so that we're not all doing the same things, so that we don't become reliant like semiconductors in one place of the world, that we're able to make sure that we have access to key things that are going to be necessary as we go forward. But does the consumer care where the Apple phone is made? Probably not. What the consumer wants in a variety of other things is best product, cheapest price. And I don't think we should believe that human nature or human behavior is going to change. And if you don't believe me, see Germany. When Germany moved too quickly on renewables, they didn't bring the public with them. And the public started to experience natural gas prices, affected partly by Russia, of a 500% increase in their utilities costs. And they said, look, I care, I just can't afford it. And so what did Germany have to do? Turn on coal. And so we've got to make sure that we bring the public with us when we're moving in this direction, because populism is our biggest threat today, from the left and the right. Both sides are putting polarization in play where the logic of the center is being lost. It doesn't even have a voice anymore. Most of the choices in democracies are black or white when the vast majority of people are gray. We are people of the radical middle. We're progressively, we're progressive on social issues. We're fiscal, conservatives on fiscal issues. This is the nature of human beings in many parts of our democracies, but they don't have a voice anymore in our system. And so how do we bring that about? And the last point I just want to make about industrial policy is this, another fact. Many, many organizations have made their commitments for 2050 net zero, but if you ask them honestly, they will tell you today they don't know how they're going to do it. They may know 25%, 30%, 50%. Sure, some have been able to find a way to do it all today. But the vast majority of CEOs I speak would say, I've been forced to make this commitment. Fiduciary duty says I should know how I'm going to do it. I don't, but I'm going to make the commitment anyways. Which means we're all going to rely heavily on innovation. And that innovation is, a lot of it is Canadian-led, by the way. I'm very proud of our industries that are driving the change on CCUS. 8 of our members are putting over $85 billion into how to get carbon captured. But remember, capturing carbon is a cost. There's no value to the carbon today. And so how much societal good are businesses responsible for? And this is where the industrial policy of sharing that and having skin in the game is going to be so important. We're going to need to clean our grids. We're going to have to do a lot more with nuclear, particularly small modular nuclear reactors, which again, Canada's at the forefront of. Hydrogen, there's a lot of dispute and debate about as to how it's going to be used or not. It's very complicated, it's very expensive, and it's very difficult to move. So we'll see how it all unfolds. But I don't think any of these things I've just mentioned are imminent. And that's the other fact that I wanted to just leave you with. We can't let hype get ahead of the facts. These things are not around the corner. We know we're the ones doing them. It's going to take some time. And so we've got to make sure that we're creating the conditions to play the long game and not just the short game here.
Thank you, Goldy.
So we've just been told about the IRA and even its political impacts. Now I'd like to hear you, all of you, on the European response to the IRA, the US IRA. So now there is the Green Deal, the net zero emission. There are many money on the table. I think there is money all over the place. So is it sufficient? Is it well calibrated? Does it make it possible to keep competitiveness or to respond sufficiently to what is being done elsewhere in the US, but also possibly in China? Now, let's start with you, Mr. Lionel FAURY, and then I'll listen to the 4 of you. What was said by Goldy is very inspiring and true, so true. We need to create long-term conditions. This is essential because this transformation is deep and it will take time. Now, when we play the long game, long-term vision, you also have to move fast, nevertheless. And in order to respond to the question about the IRA, well, there's an expression, what's simple is false, but what is not simple cannot be used. The IRA is a bit simplistic, but it's very powerful. And we see the investment going rapidly towards the utilization of IRA subsidies. And we've seen the US, which were late on decarbonation, accelerating in this domain, which is quite in a spectacular way. Now, is the European response at the level of the IRA? Well, I don't know. Well, if I want to be optimistic, I say we don't know yet. If I want to be pessimistic, I said it's such a patchwork of small, complex solutions, sometimes contradictory, and which leaves room to different solutions in different countries. I'm not too optimistic. It's not that the intention is not there, but the complexity of the system is such that it could lead us to what is simple is false, but what is not simple cannot be utilized. So I'm very worried about the efficacy and the European response, which reflect the difficulty we face to agree among ourselves. It was said differently here among Europeans to have something simple and efficient. And for the investment to join, to be deployed, for capital to be deployed and to find the return of this investment, we we need a single play field and long-term vision. Today in Europe, we lack that direly. Yeah, it's more vision than money, actually. It's more the joint normalization than money. When you see IRA, $360 billion US, just a few months before, the European industrialists were scared by the Germans who put 200 billion euros into support to German businesses after the energy crisis. So it's more than half of the IRA. So if we sum up everything in the 27 countries, we could cover that. So cover what is done in the US. So it's not a question of means. We have the means. It's not an issue of market. We have the market, 500 million European consumers. But today it is scattered, disordered, and we are other Europe gets together or it will disappear. So either we invest absolutely now for the green fuels for new airplanes, or let's invest in the restoration of historical heritage so that the rich American will come and see us and visit us. So discussion on common standard. Let me give you an example. We talk about nuclear power plant. Okay, the Sweden still has nuclear power plant, but they have a law which prohibits to do research, uranium research on their territory, because they clean trees and mountains. So they want us to keep the bush to look for uranium. So with countries with situations like that in each country, we'll never be able to. You can do 100 conferences in X on the fact that we're late behind the Americans or tomorrow India or China, but we'll never. Either we work together or we will fail. So does the European response goes through what we call the market design, the operation of the market for energy? Well, the world of carbon neutrality, the second is the world of biomass and recovery. So the rest is electricity, which tomorrow will be majority. Well, it is in progress, but it's not finished. There is a reform going on now of the European market for electricity, and we still don't agree among countries. In my opinion, we have to go for two conditions. We have to offer stable long-term electricity prices to the industrialists. They need to invest, so they need a horizon so that their investment would be profitable. That's the first thing, stability. And of course, then there is the question of price. The fact that electricity, and we've seen that during the crisis, the electricity price is indexed to the gas price without any possible regulation. This is a problem. We need to find a device that will pool prices towards the real effective production cost. It's a real challenge. So the restructuration of the market, it's in progress, and we have to change some reactions to production. We said we will consume more electricity tomorrow, so we'll have to produce more. So far, so good. But once this being said, we have to tackle issues that state support policies. This is getting more flexible, but we have not reached the end of the road. What's interesting in that in the industrial decarbonation, we have to tackle our real problem, principle, historical vision, so that we offer people like Guillaume a stable framework for long-term investment. Let me take an example. If the air industry, the aeronautic industry tomorrow uses hydrogen-based fuel, which is itself produced by electrolysis, which is produced by electricity. So we have to provide an affordable fuel to the air industry. So we need to produce electricity, which is decarbonated and, of course, cheap. Last point. All this goes through infrastructures because this electricity, tomorrow's electricity, has to be produced. We have to consume it, indeed. Among the two, we need infrastructures and networks, but And when the first European work started, there was nothing on the networks. So for tomorrow, this will be tens and tens of billions of investments. So we've corrected that, and there will be some kind of a large roundtable in September with, on networks. But it is an illustration of the fact that we haven't been able to globally tackle the problem. And I'll be kind of feel good. There are blocks, but then we can discuss the operation of the market, the state support, and grids, infrastructures. We haven't been able yet to produce a global answer. So let's hope it will come. Sylvie, Goldy, and then we'll take questions from the audience. I'm sure there are plenty of questions. Well, rapidly. And in addition, I want to come with an optimistic note. When I'm listening to my team, I said, we've never been in such a storm. I mean, clearly there are calls for projects, there are requests from our clients, there is action on the field, it's speeding up. Clearly. Now, and in all countries where we are, in Middle East, Poland, wherever, in the UK, US, so things are moving. In France, there are calls for projects regularly to change the fuel and or gas boilers. So, France 2030, more 20 billion for decarbonation, or more than. I can't remember many billion on the hydrogen, but it is speeding up, and the trend is on. So, okay, let's look at the glass half full. Now, Denis, you want to ask a couple of points?
Yeah, I just wanted to say two things that I think need to be reconciled. One is the fact that carbon tax is not a normal application in different parts of the world, starting with the United States of America, that doesn't have a carbon tax. And so it's complicated from a policy environment when you're having different responses on something as basic as market mechanism as possible. I'm proud to say that the Canadian business community I represent endorsed the carbon tax in 2008, and despite pressure from different political parties of different stripes throughout, we've held our course because the fact is it's the best mechanism from a market perspective to be able to price the carbon. The second thing I think we need to look at more globally, and this is about the framework point, is emissions, as I said at the outset, don't respect any borders. So if a country like, say, Canada has a lot of LNG and there's a global demand for it, but we're debating internally in our country that if we export that LNG, it will have the net effect of raising Canadian emissions and therefore making it harder for us to reach our targets. However, if we were able to get that LNG to market through Japan, Korea, India, all kinds of places, the overall global emissions would be reduced. We would get no credit for that. And so we're landlocking ourselves in our LNG for the most part. We're distributing some, but not a lot. We could do a lot more. And the debate inside the country is this, and I think it's a false debate. If you are an environmentalist and you believe that we have to address climate change to the level that we all do, then the goal should be to reduce global emissions. You shouldn't be punished if your emissions may go up or may have to go up to help bring down global emissions. I thought that was the objective.
Do we have questions from the audience? No questions? Raise your hand. Don't be shy. Come on, madam. Thank you. Thank you for your presentations. Two questions. First, to Mr. Canada, says the lady. Canada has been recognized for this energy policy, very specific. Could you dwell on that? Second question has to do with all speakers and Dalkia. What's the role of digital in your decarbonization policy?
I'm proud to say, as I mentioned, that the Canadian business community and the Canadian energy sector in particular long ago committed to the transition, long ago has set goals in place, but we're driven by facts. And the facts is there are demands that are going to continue for oil and gas. Even Norway, which built its sovereign wealth fund on oil, has now come back after telling everybody else to not do it and relaunched their oil platforms and their programs. Because the facts are, as I said, what they are. There is increasing demand as the global population grows and as the middle class grows, particularly in Indo-Pacific and in Asia more broadly. And so we're going to have to make sure that we can meet that in the most environmentally friendly way, addressing CSR and stuff. The Canadian energy sector is also cognizant that doing good is good business. And so we have a duty to drive towards the policies that our governments have put in place to achieve 2030 targets and 2050 targets. The problem is these targets just get picked. And the truth is we're a long ways. All of us, frankly, I think very few countries are going to meet their targets. We didn't meet Kyoto, we didn't meet Paris, we probably won't meet whatever comes up, Copenhagen and other things next. Because we keep setting targets without looking at how is it that we're going to get there. And I think that's a critical component. I just want to repeat, the role of innovation is going to be central to this. You know, to capture carbon, to move it, to store it. It doesn't get stored anywhere. There's a certain kind of places where it gets stored is key. Small modular nuclear reactors. Hydrogen, as I mentioned, it's so complicated. It has to be frozen at like minus 200 degrees on a ship to be sent to Europe. You have to like maybe break it up and put it back together. You have to have the capacity to export it and receive it. It's probably more industrial in nature. I don't think it'll be very commercial in nature, but these are things that the Canadian business community are leading the charge on. I just think we would benefit from a more coherent global policy that would allow us to help other countries decarbonize, even if our emissions might creep up and may affect our targets.
Merci. Une réponse, Sylvie et Madame.
Le numérique, une réponse rapide. Alors d'abord, on a tendance...
Quick answer about digital. Well, everybody is pinpointing digital. Your CO2 emission from IT, 6%. Digital, but digital is data centers, it's electricity, so electricity will be decarbonated, digital will be decarbonated, and by the way, we know how to collect, we recover the heat from the data centers to warm up housing, so it's part of the solution for two reasons. We'll use digital to deal with the consumption data, all consumption data of our clients and industrialists, and including to do energy savings, energy efficacy, first axis, second main axis. We will manage energy ecosystems. I've listed the solutions, but often on one side there will be all the solutions, including the storage solutions, and therefore we will have to manage energy so that at the right time we'll consume as little as possible and as best as possible and with the lowest carbon level. And this will be thanks to the digital system. Any other question? One at the back, very back. Hello. Geophysician, engineer, member of a climate association. So could we ask ourselves, well, could we all ponder the issue of hydrogen and the need of, the resources needed for that, be it for the production of, but also for the water resources, because nobody talks about that. But in fact, we come to a period when water is becoming scarce, so we'll give priority to water for the farmers, possibly before giving water to produce hydrogen to fly planes, and possibly to give it keep a bit for our industries, we need also, which need water, as well. So I would like to respond to the hydrogen and the issue of water. Each country has its own strategy when it comes to hydrogen. What we should bear in mind that the first usage for hydrogen would be to replace the hydrogen used for the industry. That will be the priority. This is where we have the first economic space, and then afterwards it will become. It can be used for storage, electricity, or mobility. But you're right to say that there are issues of water resources in dams, rivers in France. But there's the ocean. Well, today the largest future hydrogen producer would be on the seaside. Of course, you have to do seawater desalination. You need highly pure water, but you know there is emergency here. So I think it's reasonable even to decarbonize the industry. You know, when you see the, you know, we need to do water electrolysis. You know, this will be resource consuming. You know, it's you know, there is water in the ocean, 71% of the surface of the earth. So let's start with that. Let's not increase difficulties to say that we won't make it. Well, we already have a very ambitious goal, 2030, 35, 2050. Hydrogen will play a role, definitely. But, you know, there are difficulties. Let's not hide it. I know there are many other questions, but maybe you will ask them just after the roundtable. I know our speakers will stay for a couple of minutes. Now, I give the floor to the end word to Lionel. And thank you in advance to the 5 speakers. It was most fascinating. The last word, Lionel. Well, the last word, 2 phrases, because we're already running at below 0 in terms of time. So we have to rush. So first point that, well, microeconomic dimension of the discussion, we talked about sobriety, and you've seen that the Cercle des Économistes is implementing this because we replaced air conditioning of the amphitheater of the university by a fan that has been distributed to each and every one of you. Great example of sobriety, except the interpreters are sweating here. But anyway, so it was a lot of things been said, but you know, as economists, what I want to keep in mind from this interesting session is that we're dealing with a dynamic issue. Now, how do we manage urgency to act with the necessity to have a long-term vision? So this is, it's a conventional economic problem, which is not easy. Economic always think that what can help solve the dynamic problem would be to have prices, to have visibility on prices, not absolute price, but on relative prices of the carbonated energy versus the non-carbonated energy. So what we need, absolutely, it was said here, is to have visibility in 2030, 40 of those relative prices between carbonated and non-carbonated energy. And it applies to industries in Poland. It applies to Airbus, manufacturing planes, but what fuel will be used to fly those planes. So this is at the core of the topic. We need energy, but also we need to know what will be the relative price of energy, carbonated versus non-decarbonated. And economists think, and I would like to insist on that, this is a message not always heard, that the price signal is something key, even though there could be other public policies that could be used, instruments. So let's move on this topic, as we've done in this, as the Canadians have done, together with Europe and many other countries. About 60 countries in the world now have a carbon price, one way or another. So it's a good way, from the economist viewpoint, to really to address this dynamic issue, which said let's act rapidly now, yeah, but with long-term perspective. That was bad French indeed. Okay, have fun.
Ça marche?
I think the microphone is working. Hello, welcome for this session on water. Is water good like any other? So to talk about this question, we've got Antoine Frérot, who's the CEO of Veolia, and Mrs. Lagumina, who's a senior partner at Argos WITU. Argos WITU. It's a fund dedicated to the decarbonisation of SMEs. I'm going to very quickly introduce the subject. We've got 25 minutes. It's a controversy. What's important is the discussion. So by way of introduction, what we can say is that in France, water is not a rare resource traditionally, but since the beginning of last year, we know that it could become a rare resource. 2022 was a very particular kind of year. We had a drought in summer, winter, autumn. In 100 municipalities in France, the water had to be cut off. And of course, the question comes up in the summer when there's no rain and when we need water for irrigation. So the scarcity of water is beginning to be felt. So just to set the scene and talk about water and the way it's shared, some figures. So in France, about an eighth of water use is consumed. It's not sent back to the natural environment. And among this kind of use, 60% is for agricultural use. So that's quite a considerable amount. 26% goes towards the production of potable water. 12% is for cooling power plants, especially nuclear power plants. So you have these three main types of water use. And the questions that are raised are about sharing. You know, with this increasing scarcity, how do we share the resource that is water? What kind of economic policies need to be set up in a world where scarcity is going to become increasingly considerable? We've seen very well that, you know, you've followed the mega basin crisis. What can we say about this? Is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? Etc. So I think that Mr. Frérot, well, we've organized the discussion in three phases. In the first phase, we're going to try and define what a common good is. If it's not a resource like any other, what is a common good? What does this imply, considering this water that is becoming scarce as a common good? Secondly, we're going to talk about the governance of this common good that is water. And then we're going to think about technological innovations. Are they going to make it possible for us to solve the problem of scarcity? Mr. Frérot, you have the floor. Thank you. Hello, everybody. So if the question is water a common good? Yes, it is a common good. But it's been a common good for many, many years. In French law, for 30 years now, water bases belong to the nation. Water basins belong to the nation. And in Europe, the European Union has a definition that is very similar to this. This allows me to suggest something. When a company managing water, whether it's private or public, like a water authority, when it invoices use of water to consumers, is it invoicing the property of the nation? No, obviously not. These companies, whether they be public or private, they're invoicing a service relating to water. You know, picking it up, distributing it, purifying it, before sending it back to the natural environment. So it's the service linked to water that is invoiced. It's not the common good itself. So a water company sells services, not water. So the fact, nevertheless, that water is a common good, and in France it's the property of the nation, means that the use of water is necessarily requires public regulation. And conflicts of use, when there are conflicts of use. So the conditions of access to water, whether we're talking about industrialists, private individuals, agricultural people, that's all managed by public policies. So water is costly to transport over large distances, so it's very important to be able to make available water where it is needed. And so water governance is often local. In almost no country is it national. It's local or it's regional, and not according to administrative limits, but according to the way it flows into catchment areas, into water basins. So there are two consequences then. It's public, it's a public good, and then there's the fact that what is invoiced is not the common good, it's the service, it's the work that goes into delivering water, what the men and women do to deliver that service, and that's what is invoiced. Thank you very much, Antoine. So you've already said everything. So perhaps I'm going to come back to the definition of this common good. Water as a common good, well, water, everybody has to have access to water. This is what the law 2006 said. And this is what the United Nations has said as part of the Water Forum. But it's also a rival good. In other words, when somebody uses this good, some people are actually deprived of that good. So the question that we need to think about today, and you raised this, is that when there is scarcity, when there is a lack of water, how do you organize the rivalry? And this brings us back to the question of governance. Another point that I'd like to add with respect to what Antoine was saying is the fact that water is it's not just the business of water companies. Today, we realize that water is essential. So you had Xavier PIECHACZYK, who was talking about dams, but we can also cite the need for water for cooling power plants. Obviously, and we talked about this, the fact that the water service, this water energy link is very important. There's also the subject of water in agriculture, and I want to continue about that on the subject that Kathleen, you talked about, the debate about mega basins. But there's another point that I would like to insist on, and that is the importance of water for industry. You said that you were working with industry. Today we need 600 liters of water for making a kilo of steel, 300 liters to make a kilo of sugar. So we need water. We increasingly need water, and there's a rivalry in terms of water use because we've got this scarcity that we didn't know about a few years ago. I work in Brittany. We're only just beginning to talk about the question of water scarcity. So the subject of governance, that's what it's all about. It's about the rivalry of uses. And then there's the tragedy of the common good, the fact that, because everybody can use the common good, nobody feels responsible to ensure that it's something that's sustainable. And then this question of governance. Yeah, we're going to have to adapt to warming, global warming. The temperature has already gone up by 1.9 degrees in France compared with the industrial area. So we probably need to review the way we produce water, we use water, the way water is distributed and shared. Do we have a future vision of how we're going to go about all of this? Well, since water is a common good, it has to be coordinated by public policies. And when water becomes scarce, increasingly scarce, these public decisions are even more important. These public policies are even more important. It's about regulating access to water for different uses. It's about arbitrating and setting up a hierarchy of uses. And I would say that because water is a common good that is becoming increasingly scarce, that it is increasingly precious, and that it has to be managed with more care. And that's why that, as well as a public governance, a good public governance, we need, in order to manage it better, We need more expertise and more professionalism. And that's where companies come in to play. Because paradoxically, it's because water is a common good and a precious common good that we need also to have the expertise of companies that have a lot of experience in this field of water management. Now, coming back to the scarcity that Catherine was talking about, there are different paths that can be explored to face this scarcity. But the first thing is to avoid waste. It's about avoiding waste, about making sure that water is used for a specific use. You know, the drop-by-drop system in agriculture, that allows for savings of natural fresh water. And a good management of water networks with fewer and fewer leaks is also a means of saving water. And beyond the fight against waste, imagine alternative resources. We think about seawater. This is what we, see in countries with not much water. It's very difficult to use seawater. And then there's the idea of reusing water that's already been used. Water has become too precious for it to be used just once, and recycling wastewater for all uses is probably what we will be seeing in the future. So of course, we can't say that we don't need companies because, it's a national pride to have companies that are in charge of water. But if we don't look at things with hindsight and we think about who's going to manage rivalries, if we don't think about it, we need, we're not going to manage things. We need to bring together around the table other players. Legislating, obviously, that's important. We had a specific source water regime. We had a specific regime for distributed water. You are the ancestors of the Roman builders. So these different regimes have changed. And in France, there's a structuring law, the 2006 law. There was another one in 1964. But we haven't had a framework that has really redefined the question of water, probably because we thought that water was still abundant. For 100 years, we've been in a system that made it possible for people to have access to potable water at the right price. Now, the question is much more critical. So, how do we go about this? When we see the attention focused on governance, whether we're talking about the OECD with its big water principles, or whether we're talking about the World Water Forum and the United Nations and what they have done, although there have been a lot of controversies of what happened in March 2022, everybody recognizes that we need a regulation system. Before we regulate, though, we've got to have awareness of these challenges. And in bad French, awareness, in English in the text, means rules that are maybe esoteric. We need reporting. In every company, we need reporting. So alongside carbon, companies are going to have to report on their use of water. We need to be aware of what we're consuming, because if we have data, that will help. The second question is regulation. So there's no water regulator in France. There are lots of municipal water regulators, and we can congratulate ourselves because they're local, and this is what we saw in the last financial report. In France, we have that advantage. Things are local from that point of view. This is what the financial reports say anyway. So the question of what is the right regional level, I come from the world of energy, and I always wonder about interruptibility. In energy, we have to manage interruptibility of different market players. We say, okay, you need to agree not to consume energy during interruptions, and that allows us to balance out the network. But we don't know how to organize that with water. I'd like to come back to the right governance scale. Water is expensive to transport, but with respect to other things, energy, it's easy to store. And so that's why it's necessary to manage it in terms of its use scope. So for the urban environment, it's the catchment area. It's where you have everybody living. If we imagine a big station for managing water with pipes across the county, that would increase the price of water by a factor of 3 or 4. So that's why we need regulations for a local water basin. We need local regulations, which means normally that we have to have the right regulation scale. We need, politicians are in the best position to be able to regulate and make decisions about use of water as a resource and define the conditions for accessing water and notably the tariffs, the rates. If I may, we're going to be disrupting the discussion. I think there isn't just, it's not just politicians who have to come around the table. We also need to invent things with respect to catchment areas and urban areas. We need to invent ways of managing the controversy. We need to make sure that people in charge of water. So you're talking about representative democracy alongside participatory democracy. You're asking for people in the water world to represent consumers, whoever they are, not just inhabitants. It might be farmers or industrialists. You want them all to take part, perhaps take part in a consultation procedure. I think that we need to ask a question. Do we need clean water to have a shower? Madam, I recommend it very much, yes. Clean water for taking a shower. So the question is, haven't we got too much clean water? Don't we use too much clean water? 20 years ago, many countries in Europe asked themselves whether they could authorize the use of rainwater falling on roofs and, for example, use the water for the flush in toilets. The Dutch did a very serious study on this question, and in 6 months, within the space of 6 months, by using the water from roofs, they saw that there was an increase in gastroenteritis and Legionella disease. So the water that comes from the sky is polluted because it runs off rooftops. And so that's why in France and in Europe, rainwater is not authorized in houses, in homes. It can be used in gardens, it can be used to wash your car, but in households, no, it's polluted. That's why for showers and toilets, it's much better to have clean water. Thank you very much. So I think that the reuse is perhaps the question that we want. The reuse of rainwater is about sanitizing water that's already been used. This is something that's important. We use 0.6% in France when some countries are aiming at 60 or 40%. And let me just talk about this further in terms of reuse of water in toilets. There's a subject that's very interesting, a study that was launched by the CNRS, the Bergem. It talks about water as a common good. And the way they address the subject is, what do I need? What kind of tools do I need in terms of research so that I have the right markers for this common good that is water? What about governance and other aspects? So it's interesting. It looks about the catchment area approach. It questions that. It questions water rates. But it doesn't talk about public property, water qualified as a common good, a public property. If you have 4 hours, I could explain to you the legal difference between a collective good, a common good, etc. But that there are differences. So this approach is interesting because it's what we want to demonstrate and how we can manage our water better. So So recycled water based on wastewater can be completely clean. In Singapore, in order to feed water with ultra-pure water, much cleaner than potable water, Veolia uses water from the sewers. It's waste, it's recycled, and it can be used for showers, most definitely. So it really depends how you take your shower in the morning, perhaps. So a quick question with a very quick answer.
Oui. Il y a une dame qui vous apporte. Oui.
So there's a lady in the front there. Jean-Pierre Darmon, lawyer. You know, recycled water. I think the essential problem to be dealt with today is about recycled water. My question is very simple. In Israel, recycled water represents 90%. And if I get it wrong, you can correct me. In France, recycled water only represents 3%. Why is that? Are we going to take the bull by the horns now so that we've got future solutions for the coming scarcity of water? So it's because we didn't have a problem with water shortages in France up until now. Now we need to tackle the issue. Why? There are other reasons. There was distrust in terms of the sanitary quality of this recycled water. And notably, those in charge of health in the country were afraid that there might be a new scandal, just like there was with mad cow disease. Now, the European Union has decided that recycled water, according to certain standards, is completely healthy. So in other countries applying European rules, they're going to be working on this question. And in France, we're going to be working on it too. We're going to be looking at the use by the population of recycled water. And then there's the anti-waste law of 2022 that makes it possible to go even further today. We've got 150, 160 projects for reuse of water. We think that this is going to be developed further because it's all about, common sense. Do we have time for a question? So I'm sorry, he doesn't want us to have questions. Perhaps we can have a chat outside? Thank you. I thought I recognised that voice.
Ah oui. Quand il arrive, bon alors les interprètes ils vont sur scène. J'ai dit non attendez là, bougez pas.
C'est pas ça du tout.
Ouais, non, il faut que je t'explique un truc là. Ici c'est moi qui gère le spectacle.
Sur comment réconcilier urbains et ruraux.
Urban and rural, so the opposition between the new city and the countryside, not new, opposition educated individuals access to public services, and the other side, you know, less active people with a lower education level. So the question we ask ourselves today, well, to assess the scope of this reality, that is, is this opposition still valid today? Is it still valid in France and in other countries of the world? We're very fortunate to have guests from other countries than France, from foreign countries, and you will hear them. And therefore, you have to want to know if the recent evolution with telework has modified this notion, opposition between rural and urban. So this is the first question we ask ourselves. Second is that how can we reconcile those two domains or populations, what public policies are expected or to be expected, which are efficient, which function, and if they function, how do they do it? So I will frame the discussion, what the economists say about those elements today in less than 2 minutes. And then the first point I would like to insist on is that this opposition is complicated to implement, to evidence in data, for the simple reason that in the INSEE, the Statistic French Survey Institute, will talk about urban, peri-urban, suburbs, center of town centers. So there's a continuum in the invitation, in the ways or in the modes of life, and what's complicated even statistically to establish tight borders. That's the first point. It's nevertheless, we know that one asset active out of 3 or slightly less than works outside of urban zones, and 80% of the population covers 80% of the territory. So it's a reality of the separation. Now, if we want to separate the two populations, well, there are inequalities. First, access to jobs. There are less than 60 jobs for 100 active in rural areas, which is not the case in urban zones, and therefore more than 1 person in rural area out of 2 works in urban zones. So there are inequalities in terms of healthcare, life expectancy in the rural area in 2 weeks shorter than in urban zone for similar age, gender, and job. And of course, inequalities in access to public services has been widely documented during the yellow vest crisis, access to healthcare, schools. We know that 100% of urban people find emergency service in hospital in 20 minutes, which is not the case in rural areas. Now, I'd like us to insist on the exchange between the two populations. Are there interactions? They're even more important than we are in the ecological transition. And of course, there are flows of energy, material, goods, and services between the two segments of the population, which make them very complementary. And the last point will be on public policies of resorption of inequalities and and even the stakes in terms of vote. You know, the vote in rural areas and the explanation of the yellow jackets. You know, with that yellow vest. Sorry, we know that one of the elements for the disgrace was to live in medium-sized cities. You know, you depend on public transport, on the price of fuel, and to feel remote from the center of town. There are recent work have been done by Claudia Seni, who's with us today, which shows more specifically that the political crisis, the vote for extreme parties, can be explained by the fact that the people belong to a city on a peri-urban zone, which has been declassified, which has lost a public service level of employment, or it's been an increase in unemployment. So clearly it is the way that you belong to a community or to municipality which is impacted by the lack of facilities. With no further ado, I'll give the floor to the experts. Thank you, Maya Bakash, for this introduction. A couple of notes and regrets before moving to the debates. It's a great trip from the mountains of Guangxi, Oslo, Dubai, or the island of Zond, or the rural territories of France. So first, it will be an accelerated trip because of the time available, and which also resembles the thematic challenges we face today. Third, just one figure to share with you. PIECHACZYK, who is chief economist at in the French Development Agency, said that in fact, in 2012, 5 million rural inhabitants would leave the countryside every month in the world. Now, maybe one regret that there is no room in this roundtable for agriculture. We can play a major role in this reconciliation between urban territories and rural territories. Thank you. Straight away, let's turn to Isabelle Arlberg. You come from Oslo, you run a car architect practice, present all over the world. Now, from the architecture and urban planning, can we reconcile urban and rural? And how do you innovate in this domain?
Excuse me for not speaking your beautiful language, but I will have to speak in English. So yes, I come from Snøhetta. We are a global architecture firm. And we've worked for the past 35 years. We've built our foundation on the Brundtland Commission's UN report, Our Common Future. So our philosophy is very much aligned with the 3 pillars of sustainability, which is economic, social, and environmental sustainability. With that in mind, I would say that Snøhetta very much designs within 4 axes when we think about urban and rural development. And those 4 axes are contextual and sustainable design. And the final one is mixed-use development and smarter growth. And so if I start off with sustainable and contextual design, we believe that as architects, we have a large responsibility for building our environment for the future. We believe that we need to design with generosity in mind, with building more openness for dialogue. And we believe that by giving back to society more than just a building, we believe that we can open up communities. And I think that's what's important for us, is that we all need to talk more, because it's all about the people. So a couple of examples. Here in France, for example, we've built the Le Monde headquarters in Paris. And if any of you have been there, you see the generosity that us and the client have given back to the public with the beautiful arc under the building, where the public can pass through to the metro station that is soon to come, but also just be able to play and have recreation there. So important that we can both work and play in the same place and open up for the public while it is a commercial building. Another example of work that we've done is Times Square and the rehabilitation. So previously in New York, Times Square was one of the busiest thoroughfares for traffic, and by making that a pedestrian area, we've actually been able to increase pedestrian safety. We've been able to increase actually revenues in the stores surrounding, and we've been able to reduce crime. Now, I can just say these things to you, and you can believe them or not, but we actually do post documentation on all these projects that we do, so we actually have finite numbers on our ability to improve societies and communities where we build. The third one, and this is a bit of a push for you all to come to Oslo, is to come and visit the National Opera and Ballet. And if any of you have been to an opera house, they're usually very traditional, usually very closed, usually very, more for high society. But when we built the opera, we really wanted to include the community in owning the opera. And so we built an opera where the public could actually own the roof. And this roof has become the largest tourist destination in Oslo now, where people walk up and down the marble roof, which is actually categorized as a piece of art, which is why you can walk on it. And more people actually visit the opera this way than they did previously. So those are just a couple of examples on how we can build and include communities in our designs. If I have one more minute left, I just want to talk about mixed use and smart growth. So with regards to mixed use, I think that's probably the route forward to incorporate urban and rural design, is that we need to build for the best of these two communities. We need to build that tight community feeling in rural development, so build mixed use where we can also, work. So build housing, commercial, and recreational facilities in one go, so that we don't get this urban sprawl. And in the cities, I love the Paris thinking or strategy about the 15-minute city, where you want to kind of incorporate the community feeling from rural into these mega cities, where you can get all you need, if it's housing, if it's commercial, if it's recreational, if it's education, if it's healthcare, all within 15 minutes. So those are also a couple of projects that we're working on.
Merci.
Thank you for concluding on the 15-minute city. Marie-Roche Debon, you're president of Keolis, 68,000 employees in the world. This notion of mobility, we saw it with the yellow vest crisis. Can we link up urban territory and rural territory? So how do you innovate in the world? Thank you, Patrice. Well, Keolis is present in the rural area and urban areas. Of course, we run metro lines, streetcars, but buses, and we also, because this is the major issue, we try to provide access to all for public transport. We said the right of the right, mobility. This mobility gives you the right to go to everything else, culture, healthcare, school, education, work. So, of course, as a public transport operator in France and in about 12 other countries, the objective is to give access to all, and concretely speak, to be concrete, to be very pragmatic, actually, in the rural environment. Well, there are new solutions, brand new solutions, which have been developed. We won't do a metro like the Grand Paris Express in the middle of bloody nowhere, but, we have other means. We have first the express buses with dedicated lanes. This is, of course, easier than, lighter than railways. It is one means to connect rapidly with priority lane, the pull-up lanes, for comfortable vehicles, buses, and we provide access to, citizens have access to locations or trips they could not do without a car. If they don't have a car, another concrete experience, you all know the, transport on request, a non-taxi, but they are public operators. If you live in Aix, for example, we do have request transport on demand. You connect yourself to the application with digital. You ask for the vehicle, and the zones which are served, and of course, these are zones which are more peripheral. And then at 2 o'clock in the morning, you're 16 and you come out of the nightclub. You don't have a vehicle and you're a bit drunk. You call Uber, sort of, or even public transport financed by local authority. And we, transport on request. Public transport on request is on demand, is there to ensure time spans very late in the evening. We call it transports. We've transported something like 2.5 million passengers on demand transport. We do ex-periphery. We do center of town, the buses in town, but we also do transport on demand in the periphery, and we transport people with reduced mobility on demand, and we do Strasbourg, Quimper, Orléans, several small cities in France. So ability to complete collective public transport with more flexible, simple systems. So, and if we are more futuristic, we run also autonomous vehicles when they will be they're not fully mature, but straight away, for the last few kilometers especially, when you get to the TGV train station in Le Creusot in the center of France, which is 15 minutes from the city center, well, how do you get to the city center? Well, the autonomous vehicles for this kind of short runs will be within the scope of the tools and concrete instruments. So the public transport operators with their clients, of course, the local authorities, which are clients, well, will provide, which provide public transport, pay more and more attention to services to zones with low population density, so that to make sure that public transport is a right for all, and for us, Keolis, it is a priority. Access to all, and in a culture of energy transition, which we want to expand in a very strong way. Well, if people are to stop using their cars, well, they must enjoy public transport. We have to replace the individual cars. So now, in order to facilitate this energy transition, when public transport to organize themselves to provide alternatives, these are a couple of concrete examples to illustrate the right of the rights. Thank you for having been very concrete with these few examples. No, we could be at the service of public policies when it comes to transport. Now, let's go to China with Zilong. So you've just published a beautiful book called Traffic Destiny. You tell the story of a family in the countryside in China. Maybe couple of minutes to tell us the origin of this book and the message of that book, which is also a very melancholic book as well. Good morning. How is it possible to reconcile cities and countries? Well, this is a topic, a global topic. We don't find answers now. Sometimes we can ask the question to ChatGPT to say how to solve the problem, and when we ask questions to computers today, the question of solving problems is more important than asking questions. Today, young people in Chinese countryside, in the rural areas, when they are not accepted at university, they will go and seek jobs, and sometimes they face women, they marry, they found their families and have children. Many of these young people want to become urban citizens. Many get worried about the problems of education for their children. And this is why often those children are actually offered to richer families who have problems of fertility. And often poor families, young poor families, will see their children grow in other families. And sometimes there are families where there are problems of adultery, and biological parents will oppose this kind of situation. So children actually come back in their families or origin. So it's complicated. This is why biological fathers often choose to disappear, actually, because their children want to remain in the sort of a more affluent families. Often, the children want to have another fate. They would rather be born in town, and many young people go back to cities to find jobs. So, children who were offered to the rich families, then do investigation. They realize that their real parents, they want to stay as young urban who were born in affluent family, but they want to keep links with their original families. And some children decide to hide the reality, actually. This means that through this type of novel, I tell the world that a lot of rural people would love to go to town, would love to live in town, but and often it's very difficult. And through this novel, we are also reminding the story. The Chinese government has several solutions to this problem. I'll come back to this in a minute. Now, Marianne Lenny, you're president of the NEBIS directory, 100% affiliate. So yeah, we talked about this system of decentralized energy. So why is decentralization of this electrical power system will make it possible to reconcile urban and rural? And what role do you play to recreate activities and your responsibility as a public utility? Thank you, Patrick. Good morning. Yes. So your question raises the issue of ecological transition between urban territories and rural territories. Well, first, let's say that, of course, cities are concerned, but the rural territories are concerned as well because of drought, of water scarcity, or hydric stress, floods, and so on and so forth. And, well, we don't know, but France is the second rural country in Europe behind Poland, with 30% of the population living in rural areas, in municipalities of less than 2,000 inhabitants. That is almost 90% of those municipalities. Now, the objective, to neutrality 2050, well, we already in France we do have the decarbonated electricity, 80% decarbonated electricity. Our topic is not to decarbonate more electricity, but it is to have more usage of electricity and to produce more and to use it in different multiple usages while having sobriety. So when we see at rural urban, what do we see? That first of all, this ecological transition somehow it is an opportunity for the rural territories because the urban territories depend on the countryside. They consume the urban territories 20 times more electricity than they produce, actually. 2/3 of renewable energy, sun, power, wind farms, biomass, small dams, biomass are 2/3 are produced in France in municipalities of less than 2,000 inhabitants. All this is growing at an amazing pace. So, at Enedis, we know that Enedis because we connect these renewable energy to the grid, and we did time 2 in volume and numbers of connection between 2022 and 2020. Today, you talked about decentralization. Just one figure: 700,000 production renewable electricity production site all over France, and 2/3 in rural, and we had to add 1 million new production sites to be connected between now and 2030. Sorry. So this evolution is it's an opportunity for the rural area. More innovation. Buildings. Get together to produce and consume part of their production. Well, it does happen as well in the rural areas, in the Morbihan, in the Brittany, in the center of France, on the west. Those are additional sources of incomes for the farmers. Now, second point I'd like to insist on is it was said, feeling of abandonment, roles, no access to public services, no education, healthcare. But that's not true when it comes to electricity. Marie-Ange said transport is the right of the right. I would say the electricity is the good of the goods. That's the one that makes it possible to heat to cook, to study, to have light on every aspect of your daily life. So when you look at the French organization, the good news is that, this access is guaranteed everywhere for everybody, whatever the weather. There are storms in the southwest. We have customers around Pau in the Pyrenees, in the land, who've lost their power supply because power lines, trees fell on power lines. Well, we, Enedis right now is sending reinforcement task force. We have a rapid task force. Your employees will come from all over France to make sure that our customers will be again served, connected to the grid rapidly in the zone. Second good news is that clients in Aix-en-Provence will pay the same price to have access to this electricity than the client in the Creuse in the center of France, where there are 9 times less clients in the Creuse, not to mention Lozère, where there is 1 client every 18 kilometers of a network or grid. So, you know, we have to invest permanently to you know, this network, it goes 35 times around the world, you know, in terms of length, you know, and largest in Europe, you know, and all the project holders for renewable electricity. If you drive an electrical car, if you want electrical heat pump, well, you got exactly the same technical conditions, then of price, condition of connection, in anywhere in France. So, and this is thanks to Linky, which has been installed today in 95% of the household. So we're not in Texas, you know. Or in Texas, grids are not interconnected, so you know you have to deal with what you have in your territory. In terms of energy transition, the topic is not self-sufficiency. It doesn't make sense for electrons that would travel, but it is the collective solidarity to be inclusive and to be inclusive through education, vocational training, you know, the social, you know, the education of working class people. So this should be accessible to everybody at the best cost, which means the best price, which means a lot of investment. And I think we have to insist on that. So lots of hope to see how this ecological transition takes place first in the rural territories. Thank you, Marianne. So the right of the right, goods of the goods for electricity, and what's the importance of pooling and public services. So how does it take place in Indonesia? Queen Mumpuni, I mean, you come from a country which has 17,000 islands. 900 of them are being inhabited in the country or in remote areas. Goods of the goods, is it also electricity? You work in a company which creates micro dams. They do electricity. So how did you do it and how does it work?
Thank you. Merci. Well, for me, poverty is a symptom. The real problem because of local community are being disconnected to their own local resources. That's why what we do is to reconnect. How we reconnect the local resources with the local community is by building a micro-hydro. Micro-hydro is a very small electricity generation from the water that utilizing the water that flow in the river. And in Indonesia, we have so many abundant, you know, those kind of resources. We have 2 approaches. The first approach is we are building that with the local community and off-grid. It's not connected to the national grid. We create a cooperative utilizing this electricity to develop the local economic, such as making patchouli oil, lemongrass oil, drying the coffee, and all agriculture productivity, so that the community has the income and they can leverage their social welfare and also the economic condition. This is the first. The second one is the electricity is connected to the grid. Because connected to the grid, so the cooperative has what we call streaming income or monthly income. The money flows from the national grid to the local community, and based on the consensus that are having a meeting in the village, they are utilizing the money for giving scholarship to the poor community, the family who cannot afford the kids going to school. So this money is plugging to use that to support the kids from the very low income family. The second is to give a subsidy for the pregnant woman so that they can have a very healthy baby. It's for also building the irrigation channel and everything that actually based on the meeting, what are the money is going to use. The very interesting for us is that we're receiving many students Franks, contribute from Grenoble University. They have many technical students who are coming and really witnessing, working together with the local community so they know how is actually to linkage between urban and rural. If in the rural area you can find a good school, good health facilities, good job, they're not going to go to the city. That's why we are promoting this as an entry point to develop economy in the village. So people are willing to stay in the village with a very good environment, but they have a very good income. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Tri Mumpuni. And thank you to all of our speakers for the diversity of your different approaches and solutions. I would like just to get you to react to the importance of public policies. You're all private players or public players, but all of that can only become consistent if we have the right public policies, if we have the right politicians who take into account these new challenges for new developments. Who would like to start? Perhaps Marie-Ange Debon? Yes, that is a question that is very important for an operator like Enedis. You will understand that our activity is long-term. We have a vision for our investments taking us through to 2040. We've published a path that we want to follow. We want to reach 100 billion euros. So when we invest €1 in renewable energy in the world, you have to invest also €1 in the network that's going to, the distribution network that makes it possible to connect the renewable energy. So we do a lot of planning. However, I think that globally we can do things better. We can do things better in France, and the recent law on the acceleration of the use of renewable energies reflects this. How can we better anticipate developments? How can we better earmark things? There are areas of the distribution network where there are potential opportunities where we can lower costs. And coming back to sobriety, today Enedis is connecting a lot of charging stations for electric vehicles. So you can have very fast charging stations, slower charging stations. It depends whether you're charging at home or you want quick charging in a service station. So Enedis is able to do this on all supermarket car parks, for example. If you go to a fast food place in a mall, for example, you can charge your car thanks to Enedis. And so we've got a service station on each car park. We do it with a lot of pleasure because it means contributing to the environmental transition. But where is the global vision? What is the consistent vision when it comes to locating these charging stations? We're talking about rare materials, we're talking about water, we're talking about investing public money and income from customers and taxpayers. So the effort to be sober with resources, with our finite resources, that's obliging us not to work from top to bottom, but locally. There's a reconciliation and there's a lot of anticipation. We need to better plan and better anticipate with our investments so that we've got the best possible investments in the next for the next 30 to 40 years. So would you like to react to that?
With you, Moyan. We need to have a government that are consistent, putting the regulation and law enforcement to use a lot of renewable energy, that actually the resources are scattered everywhere. And Indonesian context, I prefer to call that we are an archipelago. So small is beautiful, island-based. They are really independent, have a very smart grid. not a continent like Europe, you know. This is very important, how to make sure that the government is pro-renewable energy and also pro-a community-based development, meaning give space to the local community to be able to have their own local resources by utilizing their own local resources for their own local community. This is the first one. The second one, political issue. Yes, politicians play a very important role. We want to make sure that politically renewable energy is become a favor of every human being. And this is not easy because we understand that coal and all fossil fuel are still belongs to the oligarch. That's why we need to have a strong policy pushed by the politician on renewable energy. Thank you.
Merci, Tri Mumpuni.
Thank you, Tri Mumpuni. So, would you like to react, Xidong? When we look at China, for example, with the Youku, with the migrant workers, with their residency permits, they don't have the same rights as urban dwellers. So, how are things moving today in China with respect to these questions? So the Chinese government wants to solve this problem. We have a program for reducing poverty, for example. So this program that we have, personally, I'm supporting 2 families, for example. In my hometown, I talk with these families. I try and understand their needs. So there is economic support that is important, but it's also important to solve other problems. So, for example, traffic. Is it possible to find doctors to treat disease? That's what they ask me. So this is the kind of thing that I help the families with. They trust me. They trust me to find a doctor for them, for example. Also for their children, I can provide help with their children. For example, they might want to have a better school or better education for their children. So schools have restrictions. There are limits in terms of admission of pupils. So for them, schools might not be accessible. So this program for reducing poverty is very important, and it consists in increasing the revenue of the population. And there are 2 phases. First of all, it's important to reduce the basic life problems. Secondly, it's important to have basic services. For example, it's important to reduce housing problems. So there we are. If we can get to grips with all of these problems, we can move communities out of poverty. There's also a collective structure focusing on reducing the gap between urban life and rural life. So, for example, in Shanghai, if we want to go to Peking, there's a high-speed train connection. But if you leave from Huineng, for the same journey in terms of kilometers, it takes 11 hours to reach the destination. If farmers want to sell their vegetables and need to take the train to go to a big city, it's very complicated for them. So you said that this roundtable would be a race against time. We've just got a few minutes for questions in the audience. There is a microphone going round. Any questions in the audience? No questions. Well, I have a question on my tablet. How can we reduce the gap between urban and rural dwellers? You've talked about this. What about in terms of public transport, fiber, optical, trade, water, energy? Let's go back to the question of water. Does somebody want to react? Or road infrastructures mainly? Marie-Ange Debon. Is there anything we can do? And how are we going about things? How are we planning things? Yes, you asked about public policies earlier on. In fact, we all think that we need decisions to be local because regions are really quite different and the problems are also quite different. So public policies, obviously there needs to be a common base, but there also needs to be a certain amount of freedom for regions to organize things in the way they wish to organize things. Local authorities today don't have much freedom in terms of their revenue. Public transport, for example, it's very important that the supply be in line with demand. So some can increase their supply, but they're also obliged nationally to stick to certain things in terms of revenue. So public policies are determining for financing, for standards, they're determining for regulations, and the training sector. If we take the training sector, for example, the transport sector, like any other sector, it's experiencing a lot of tension. So what about training public policies? They haven't always focused their efforts on the right subjects. There's a focus on scientific subjects, but mobility is not there in training programs. So all of these regulatory aspects are determining factors if we want to have a reconciliation between urban and rural issues. It's not just financing. We need to have a regulatory framework so that things are more local when it comes to decisions being made. Thank you, Marie-Ange Debon. Maya Bakash, perhaps you would like to conclude? Well, let me just go back to the question about infrastructures. There's another essential infrastructure that we didn't talk about, telecom and internet networks. Today, they really are at the heart of the matter when it comes to regional issues. We can't have people working from home if there's no access to communication structures, especially with fiber-based networks and mobile networks. So public policies have been determining in this sector. For fiber connections, the private market went to profitable areas first and foremost, places where there was a dense population. We had to have the France Très Haut Débit public policy to force them to go to areas where the market was not immediately profitable. So when it comes to infrastructures, you know, economists agree with this. For infrastructures, the role of the state is essential. So if I were to conclude now with respect to what we've heard, there are two words that are important, according to me. The first is sustainable. You've all talked about the energy transition, the environmental transition, and I think there's a whole range of questions and decisions to be taken. You know, taking decisions is not that easy. There are political choices to be made, yes, between dense cities where you have where you're less than 50 minutes away from everything, and we love that, you know, being able to access services and shops very easily. But at the same time, and there are things to be done in this area, people want to go out into the countryside and feel the quiet. So what do we do in the future in terms of public policies? There are life communities that are very integrated. Is that what we want to continue? Or do we want further away spaces with a lot of mobility, a lot of public transport? I don't think that we've decided what we want. And perhaps us as citizens, we don't really know what we want. We can't do everything, obviously. I don't see how we could possibly do everything. So coming back to transition, we need to renew the debate about urban inequalities. It's not just about, you know, some people are consuming, others are producing. Inequalities are going to be unsettled. Contributions are going to be different. You know, this is what we have to tackle in the future. The second word that I would like to share on top of sustainability is the word integration. You practically all use the word integration. So it's not just about reconciling urban and rural matters. It's about rebuilding a community. We've just come out, well, we're in a very conflictual era, and to succeed with our transition, We need integration. We need to work together. We need to reform a community and reshare needs. We need to look at inequalities of access to services, to mobility. So we've got to look at redistribution. Thank you to all of our speakers. So hope is the leitmotif of our meeting in Aix. So I think we can hope, listening to what you've said. So Xidong will be dedicating, signing his book today at the FNAC shop. So if you want to go and pick up his book at the FNAC. Thank you very much.